there, I'm Cynthia. Welcome to my Quilt Lab. Today I am working on a block from the Solare Block of the Month hosted by Banyan Batiks by Northcott and bound to Be Quilting. Big thanks to Adirondack Quilts, Southland Falls for hosting this with me. It is month number 5. Here it is right here. There it is in the quilt, right there and right there. And we're going to be making 2 of these, so let's jump in and see what month 5 has in store for us. Alright, so this block is called Starburst. Isn't it pretty? The star bursts in the block, and we are using 5 different types of fabric. We're using the fabric 5 teal, fabric 6 vanilla, fabric 7 that is pumpkin, and then also some fabric 11, the midnight sky. Isn't that pretty? And fabric 12, which is that light blue. So you can see there's 3 different kind of blocks in here. One of them's just a plain one. We have some quarter square triangles. Quarter, 1, 2, 3, 4 quarters. So we have 4 of those. And then we have 4 of these kind of wedge star pieces too. And that's definitely something that we want to talk about. Let's just talk about cutting your fabric real quick. The teal is very simple, of course. It's just a square right there. You can see I've already done one, so there's the other one of that. Then you'll see fabric 7 will have some templates. That's the little wedge pieces here on the corners, and then some squares that you're going to be using to make the quarter square triangles. Same thing with the pumpkin. It's just a bunch of squares that we're going to be cutting to do the quarter square triangle. The midnight sky is all about the template pieces, which I'll talk about in just a second. And that last light blue, again, is squares that we're going to be cutting to make the quarter square triangles. Let's address this fun square in the corners, those template pieces. So let me grab a few things real quick. Okay, so when you get your instructions in your fabric, you're going to see that there's one page that is about a template. So let me just show that real quick. There's the template. There's 2 corner pieces, and that one main block, that center block, is that pretty midnight sky. So let's talk about that template real quick, because there's a couple of options that you can do. You can make copies of that template on a piece of paper and use it as a cutting template. If you want just a piece of paper, and then you do trace it or use it as a template to cut around the fabric. You can transfer that to a plastic template acrylic. Let me pull out a piece of paper so you can see it a little bit better. So there's the 3 pieces, just like that you see. And then you can use this on your piece of paper. Get your favorite marking tool, whether it's chalk or pencil or pen, whichever, and trace that on each piece of fabric and then cut it out. So that's an option she talks about. You can find this acrylic template at those big box stores. It comes in a big sheet, or you can special order them from your local fabric stores if they don't have them. It's a really nice product. It is pretty thin, so what you want to do is the same thing with the paper, is trace it after you take it to the sheet of paper, the sheet of fabric, excuse me, because you can actually run your blade over that plastic if you're just using it to cut on fabric. I did this with one of the blocks just to show it. So that's using the template. I used the plastic, and that big sheet will last you a long while because you're going to be having some templates in future months as well. So it's a nice investment. I do want to give you some other options. The plastic templates, that's what the Bound to Be Quilting ladies suggest. You can use freezer paper. Freezer paper is the paper that has paper on one side and it's kind of that waxy side on the other. You'll find freezer paper in the same aisle at your grocery store that foil is found in, or butcher paper is found in. You do want to make sure that you grab the box that says freezer paper. This is not parchment paper. This is not butcher paper. This is not the wax paper. It is specifically called that freezer paper. And when you trace it onto your paper, the freezer paper, I did 4 of them, 1 for each corner. And I can iron this onto the fabric, and it makes it stick just a little bit. So then I can go back and leave it on the paper and cut around it with my rotary. I actually left a little edge work around all of it so that I could cut it straight using a ruler and my rotary color. Freezer paper is a great option if you don't like the acrylic option. I'm going to talk about a third option as well. You can actually make your own paper piece block if you want to. And the reason I did that is because my cutting wasn't all that great. See how it's kind of diagonal here in places? So what I did is I took my block and did a little thinksy. So these are all 3.5 inch unfinished blocks, right? So it's the idea that that inner side is going to be 3. So I just got a ruler out and a piece of paper, and I made a 3-inch block. So 1, 2, 3. Turned it around to get the other 2 corners. So that's the finished 3-inch. I then took my ruler to the wedge pieces to see how wide they are, and it comes in right at the halfway mark. So that's 1.5 inches. So this is what I did. I went into it 1.5 inches, and I put a little mark right there and on the other side. Right there and right there. And then all you have to do is put the diagonal into the corner. 1 and 1. So there's that finished block, right? And then I just labeled them. I made my main block number 1, number 2, and number 3, and I treated it as a very, very simple paper piecing. Don't forget that if you're new to paper piecing, you haven't done that before, you can check out some of my videos. I've done paper piecing before in some previous videos. Make sure that you're putting your 1/4 inch all the way around, so you have that unfinished. So that's the 1/4 inch. You want to make sure your fabric goes all the way across. And that's just another option if you want it to be, if you like paper piecing, you don't want to use either the template or the freezer paper or regular paper templates. Easy peasy, whichever way you go. I just like to give out some options so that you can do what floats your boat, okay? So I did the paper piecing for all of these 4 corners, and the other squares are just cutting them in half diagonally and diagonally. And I'll do that here in a second, and we'll talk about putting that block together too. All right, let's move on and talk about piecing all this fun stuff together and get this block finished. All right, so let's talk about those corner squares first, since we just spoke about templates and such. So let's focus on that, and I'm just going to bring out a little kind of cutting diagram. So after you've cut your templates, we're talking about the template version of this at the moment. Once you've cut out your templates, whether you're using freezer paper, acrylic, paper, whatever, this is how you're going to lay it out on your fabric. You'll have your vanilla beige fabric, and you'll lay it out this way a few times and then that way a few times, because you'll see that there's an A and a reverse A. You want to have that long piece, that long triangle piece going along the lengthwise of that, and that way the bias will be on the diagonal. Trust me, it'll work better this way than if you were to, you know, wonkily just fit it in where you can. And then you have a couple of squares of that as well for the 1/4 square triangles. Also on the midnight square, you're cutting it this way along the edge of the fabric. You want that corner where we see here, we want those on the length and the width of the fabric. That way that diagonal piece is the bias cut. I just want to reiterate that with bias cutting, please make sure you're using just really accurate cutting and really accurate seaming. I like to break out my best press or starch when I do these fabrics, before I cut anything, and then I just hit it again when I'm going to stitch everything. That way I make sure the fabric doesn't shift and move and stretch as bias tends to do when we get started. Let's talk just quickly about that paper piecing version. You'll have a lot of extra fabric, so you want to decide which way you're going to go first. Are you going to do the way the instructions say using a template, or are you going to make your own little paper piecing? Either way, you will have enough fabric and more to do both pieces. And of course, with paper piecing, you want a piece that's bigger than the actual piece that you're going to be cutting. So for instance, you want those little wedge pieces to be about 2.5 by 4 inches. You will have enough fabric to do it this way if that's what you want to do. And I'll show piecing the same for both too as we get along. So speaking about piecing, let's do some piecing. So we got our template all cut out, and you'll see in the instructions it's very easy. Grab one of each of them, the A and the reverse and that main part. You want to make sure that you print it out, that you cut out your little notches the way you ought to, because that's going to line up when you put everything together right there. And you're just going to seam 1/4 inch along the side and then press it open. Then you do the other side same way. Put those notches together, seam, press it open. You have to do one seam at a time, completely and finished and pressed it before you can do that other one, okay? So I'm going to go and take this to the machine. I'll show a couple pictures as I go, and then we'll talk about that paper piecing version. To the machine. Alright, and there's that finished block. If you need to trim up a little bit, which I did here a little bit on the bottom, so that it gets to a 3.5 unfinished, that way it makes the 3-inch finished, go ahead and do that now so you don't have to worry about it when we put the block together. Let's talk about the paper piecing. Okay, so I have my 3 pieces of fabric, and you'll note that they are much bigger than what that piece is supposed to be, and I do that on purpose because that way I make sure that I have a little bit of an overhang. A lot of paper pieces will tell you that they do 1/8 inch bigger. I like to go 1/4 inch bigger because heck yeah, it's hard to unseam. It's hard to make a piece of fabric bigger than it is smaller. So if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I love paper piecing. So grab your pieces. I use just one single pin usually, and my piece of paper. I'm just using office paper right now, guys. Nothing fancy here, but there is great products out there. There's a Carol Doak paper piecing. It's kind of like newsprint. It's awesome. So I like to pre-fold all of my pieces. That way I don't have to fuss about it when I get going. And the idea of a paper piecing is that the paper is a mirror image. Now we don't have to worry about that with this block because it's already a mirror image, which is nice. So I'm putting my paper right on top of that number 1, right there. And I'm just going to throw a pin in on this side, so that when I go to flip it over, it isn't an issue. You can use a dab of glue too if you want to. Fold that number 2 back. And if you have a ruler, you're going to trim away all but 1/4 inch. I love paper piecing, so I got my little handy dandy add 1/4, which it just butts up against the fabric. So I'll swipe this away. That gives a nice clean edge, so that way when I go to, just grab that pin out, grab my second piece, I can line it up against that edge right there. and I'm putting the pin as far away from that edge as possible because that's where my seam is going to be, and I don't want that pin to get knocked when I take it to the sewing machine. So you see there's that pretty 1/4 of an edge. All I got to do now is take that to the machine and stitch away. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my needle right there, stitch all the way across, and I'm going to stitch actually all the way to the edge of through that 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so let me go take this to the machine. I'll be right back. Oh, let me mention, shorten your stitch length. You want to make these shorter, that way when we go to tear the paper off at the end, it's more perforation points so that it's easier to tear away. So let me go do that. I'll be right back in just a second. All right, so there's that stitch. I have already pressed it open. Gave it a little spritz. I press fabric on top so I'm not pressing on the paper, but it's not a big deal if you happen to hit a little bit of the paper. So now it's time to do the other side. It's the exact same process. I'm folding this back from between number 1 and number 3. I'm grabbing my handy dandy add a 1/4 ruler and I'm trimming away the excess. And then I flip it over, grab that piece of fabric and line it up against that edge, and I'll throw a pin in. And now I take this to the sewing machine, and I'm actually going to start right here, and I'm going to go all the way through both sides of that seam allowance. All right, to the machine. And there we go. There's the 3 pieces already done. So the last step is to cut it down to that unfinished size, which we know is 3.5, and that's why I put the little seam allowance in. Gonna grab my ruler, grab my blade, and this is a good opportunity to grab your rotating mat if you happen to have one. Love my rotating mat, but for camera's sake, I will just do this normally with just my normal things. No added fun. No added fun today. Gotta get these blocks done. Gotta move along. Three, and the 4th side right there. All right, so that's the 3.5 inch square. So whichever way you decide to do this, whether you're using templates or whether you're using the paper piecing method that I just showed you, it's all good. I'm hoping I get a few options and figure out which one you like best. Make these 3 more times so that you have the 4 corners, and you can take your paper off, which is really easy if you're doing the paper piecing because we made it a shorter stitch length. It just peels right off nicely. And yeah, do those 4 corners, come back, and we'll talk about the 1/4 square triangle block. Okay, so let's move on to this block. It's a 1/4 triangle square. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a 1/4. So grab those 4 squares, that the vanilla, pumpkin, and the 2 light blue. And we need to cut these diagonally both ways. And since I didn't use my rotating mat previously, I thought I'd break it out for this one to show you how fun it is to have a rotating mat. I've lined the square up on these lines at the points because I like to use every tool available to me. And I'm just going to swipe both ways. And let me show you how cool this rotating mat is. If you don't have one of these, I love this thing because I can do a little swipe here. And I turn the mat to 1/4. Be careful picking up that ruler so you don't adjust the fabric. And then put it back down the other way. Easy way to cut fabric without having to move any of it, right? All right, so each one of these piles is going to be one of those 4 squares, and it's going to look a little something like this. A little something like that. So now our next step is to put this together. I'm going to put 2 of them together, the pumpkin and the blue, and then the vanilla and the blue. And I'm actually going to press towards that blue because it's going to be a constant. That way when I go to do that center seam, it'll nest here in the center. Of course, if you'd like to press the seams open, that's your prerogative. It's your quilt. No quilt police here. I want you to do what's comfortable for you. And we're going to do that 4 times so we get the north, south, east, and west of that block done. So I'm going to take a few pictures as I go, and I'll see you in just a few moments. Alright, so there's the 4 blocks. The last step is to square up, and I have my rotating mat back out, so I'm just laying it on those diagonal lines, that diagonal right there. It's supposed to be 3.5 unfinished, and you can see that there's 3 inches and I should be a quarter over, but I am just a smidgen bigger. So that's great because now I can square it up and make it look real pretty. So let's do that real quick. Alright, there we go. So do that with all 4 of them. And let's gather all of the blocks now to put it together in its final staging. Let's go. Alright, so here are all the blocks. You put the quarter triangle squares at the north, south, east, west, and those fun template ones in each of the corners. So you know what we're going to do. We got to put these in rows first and then put the rows together in a final block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do each row first. I'm going to press in towards the squares right here, the quarter squares, and then the other way for that middle one so that they'll nest up when we go to put the 3 rows together. But don't worry, I'll take pictures as I go and show you the back of the block as when it's finished. And yeah, let's get going and put this block together. To the sewing machine. And there we go. There's that finished block. Don't forget, you're going to want to make 2 of them this time around. And yeah, that's the end of month 5. Awesome job, everyone. Starburst block. Be sure you hit the thumbs up and subscribe button so you continue to see what's going to happen in the following months for Solare. And hey, thanks for joining me in my quilt lab. Keep on quilting.